All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking all about managing an audit program and really digging into how organizations make sure that their management systems are actually working the way they should.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for anybody out there who wants to make sure they really understand this stuff, in a way that makes sense, we're going to be focusing specifically on Clause 5 of ISO 19011.2018.
Okay, so that's the core of it, right? Like that's where all the details about running a successful audit program actually live.
Pretty much, yeah. It's the heart of the standard when it comes to this stuff.
I like it. Okay, so we're going to kind of be like your guides for this session then, right?
Exactly. Think of us as your instructors.
Perfect. All right, so we're going to break down this whole clause piece by piece,
Yeah.
and we really want to explain not just what the standard says, but why it matters, right?
Absolutely, because just knowing the rules isn't enough. You got to understand the reasoning behind them.
Right, it's all about understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's what we're here to help you do.
Awesome, okay. And our main source for all of this, as you might have guessed, is ISO 19EO11.2018 itself.
Yep, straight from the source.
Okay, cool. So
Yeah.
let's jump right into it then with Clause 5.1, General.
All right, so this clause kind of lays the groundwork by, defining what we actually mean by an audit program.
Okay, so it's like setting the stage, right?
Exactly. So
Yeah.
in simple terms, it's basically a set of one or more audits planned out over a specific time period with a clear purpose in mind.
Okay, so it's not just a random collection of audits, it's a coordinated effort.
Exactly. And this program can cover one or multiple management system standards, and these audits can be done separately or sometimes even combined.
Interesting. So there's flexibility there depending on the organization's needs, I guess.
Absolutely. The standard really emphasizes that the scope of the audit program needs to be tailored to the specific characteristics of the organization being audited.
Okay, so one size doesn't fit all.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
You got to consider things like the size of the organization, the nature of their business, how complex their operations are, the risks and opportunities they face, even how mature their management systems are.
So a huge company with a lot of moving parts is going to have a way more extensive audit program than a smaller, simpler company.
Exactly. It's all about proportionality.
Makes sense. What about situations where a company outsources some of its operations or relies on external partners? How does that factor into the audit program?
That's a really important consideration, actually.
Yeah.
The standard specifically points out that when you've got key decisions being made outside the organization or significant functions being outsourced, you have to really think about how to include those areas in your audit program.
So you can't just ignore them because they're not directly under your roof.
Exactly. And for programs that involve multiple locations or outsourced activities, you need to pay extra attention to the design planning and even validation of your audit processes to make sure everything is being assessed properly.
It sounds like there's a lot to think about when you're dealing with those more complex scenarios.
There is, but even if you're a smaller organization with less complicated operations, you still need an audit program.
Right. It's just a matter of scaling it down to fit your specific context.
Exactly. And regardless of size, the foundation of any good audit program is a solid understanding of the auditee's overall context.
Okay, so you need to know what their goals are, what kind of environment they operate in, what their stakeholders care about, things like that.
Exactly. You need to know their objectives, any relevant internal and external issues they're dealing with, the needs and expectations of all their interested parties, even things like information security and confidentiality protocols.
It sounds like it's really about getting a holistic picture of the organization.
It is, and understanding those elements isn't just about ticking boxes on a checklist. It can actually lead to uncovering risks that might not be immediately obvious.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about compliance, it's about finding ways to improve things.
Exactly. And internal audits shouldn't just be about finding fault. They should be about helping the organization achieve its goals.
Right. It's all about continuous improvement.
Absolutely. Well-designed internal audit programs can provide really valuable insights that can feed into the organization's broader objectives and help them get better at what they do.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned something earlier about maintaining the integrity of the audit process. What did you mean by that?
Oh, that's really important. The standard is very clear that audit integrity has to be protected.
Meaning the audits have to be honest and unbiased, right?
Exactly. You can't have any undue influence that could compromise the objectivity of the audit.
So no pressure from higher ups to sweep things under the rug or anything like that.
Absolutely not. And when it comes to deciding where to focus your audit efforts, You should prioritize areas with higher risk and lower performance.
Okay, so you want to go where the potential problems are most likely to be.
Exactly. It's about being strategic and using your resources wisely.
And of course, you need competent people to actually manage this whole process, right?
Oh, absolutely. The standard is very clear about that the audit program needs to be managed by individuals who have the necessary knowledge, skills, and experience.
Okay, so what kind of information should an audit program document actually include? It sounds like it's probably a pretty long list.
It is. There are quite a few key elements. The standard specifies things like the objectives of the program, the risks and opportunities associated with running the program, and the actions you plan to take to address them, the scope of each individual audit within the program, the audit schedule, which details things like the number, frequency, location, and duration of the audits, the types of audits being conducted, like whether they're internal or external, single or combined, the criteria that will be used to evaluate the auditee, the methods that will be employed during the audits, the criteria for selecting and assigning audit team members, and any relevant documented information that's needed to support the program.
Wow, that's a lot to keep track of.
It is, but it's all essential for a well-run program. And keep in mind, some of these details might evolve and become more defined during the detailed planning stages for each audit.
Right, so you start with the framework and then fill in the specifics as you go along.
Exactly. And once your program is up and running, you can't just set it and forget it.
Right. You need to keep an eye on things and make sure it's working the way it should.
Absolutely. You need to continually monitor and measure the program's implementation to make sure it's actually achieving its intended outcomes. And you should periodically review the program itself to identify areas for improvement or necessary adjustments.
So it's a living document constantly evolving and adapting.
Exactly. And there's actually a visual representation of this whole process in the standard figure 1 in ISO 1911-2018, provides a helpful flowchart of the process for managing an audit program.
Oh, cool. So you can actually see how all the different elements we've been talking about fit together.
Exactly. It illustrates how the Plan-Do-Check Act cycle, or PDCA cycle,
Yeah.
applies to audit program management.
Oh, right. That's that fundamental principle of continuous improvement where you plan something, do it, check how it's working, and then act on those findings to make it better.
Exactly. And figure 1 shows how that cycle works in the context of managing an audit program.
That's really helpful. I like having that visual representation.
It definitely makes it easier to understand the big picture.
Okay, so we've covered the general principles now. Let's move on to Clause 5.2, which is all about establishing the objectives of the audit program.
All right, so this is where we start getting into the nitty-gritty of what we want to achieve with our audit program.
Right. It's like setting the destination for our journey.
Exactly. And the standard is very clear about who's responsible for setting those objectives. It's the audit client.
Okay, so the organization that's being audited is the one who ultimately decides what they want to get out of the audit program.
Precisely, these objectives are super important because they provide the direction for everything that comes after planning, executing the audits, the whole 9 yards.
So they're like the guiding principles, right?
Exactly. And the objectives should be aligned with the audit client's overall strategic direction and their management system policies.
So they shouldn't just be random. They should fit into the bigger picture of what the organization is trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And when it comes to setting these objectives, the audit client needs to consider a whole bunch of factors.
Okay, like what?
Well, for starters, they need to think about the needs and expectations of all the relevant interested parties, both inside and outside the organization.
So what are the stakeholders looking for? What do they care about?
Exactly. Then they need to look at the characteristics and requirements of their core processes, products, services, and projects, anything that's essential to their operations.
And how those things might be changing or evolving over time?
Exactly. Then, of course, they need to consider the requirements set out by the relevant management system standards themselves.
Oh, right. Those are the baseline requirements they need to meet.
Absolutely. And then there's the need to evaluate the performance of any external providers they rely on.
So any contractors or suppliers that play a significant role in their operations.
Exactly. And they also need to assess their own current performance levels and how mature their management systems are.
Okay, so are they hitting their targets? Are there any recurring issues? Are their systems robust and well established?
Exactly. They need to look at things like key performance indicators, any reported nonconformities, customer complaints, that sort of thing.
So they're really taking stock of where they're at right now.
Exactly. And then, of course, they need to factor in any identified risks and opportunities that are relevant to their operations.
So anything that could potentially impact their ability to achieve their objectives?
Exactly. And finally, they should look back at the findings from any previous audits they've had.
So they're learning from past experience.
Exactly. It's all about taking a holistic view
Yeah.
of their current situation and using that information to set meaningful objectives for their audit program.
Okay, so it's a pretty involved process.
It is, but it's worth it because well-defined objectives are the foundation of a successful audit program.
Absolutely. So can you give us some examples of what these audit program objectives might actually look like in practice?
Sure, the standard offers a few examples.
Yeah.
One objective might be to identify opportunities for improving the management system and its overall performance.
So finding ways to make things even better.
Exactly. Another objective might be to evaluate how well the auditee understands its own organizational context.
So are they aware of all the factors that could impact their operations?
Exactly. And another objective could be to assess their ability to effectively manage risks and opportunities.
So are they good at identifying and responding to potential problems and opportunities?
Precisely. And they could also set an objective to make sure they're complying with all the relevant requirements, whether those are statutory, regulatory, contractual, or related to certification standards.
So making sure they're ticking all the boxes.
Exactly. And they might also want to build confidence in the capabilities of their external providers.
So making sure their partners are up to snuff.
Precisely. And another objective could be to determine whether their management system is still suitable, adequate, and effective for its intended purpose.
So making sure it's still fit for purpose.
Exactly. And finally, they might want to evaluate how well their management system objectives are aligned with their overall strategic direction.
So making sure everything is working together towards the same goals.
Exactly. Those are just a few examples, but you can see how the objectives are all focused on helping the organization improve and achieve its goals.
Right. And it's not just about finding faults, it's about gaining valuable insights.
Absolutely. Now, moving on to Clause 5.3, which deals with determining and evaluating the risks and opportunities associated with the audit program itself.
Wait, so the audit program itself can have risks and opportunities.
It can. Just like any other significant undertaking within an organization, an audit program isn't immune to potential challenges or areas where things could be improved.
That's an interesting perspective. I guess I hadn't really thought about it that way before.
It's easy to get caught up in thinking about the risks and opportunities faced by the organization being audited, but the audit program itself has its own set of factors to consider.
Okay, so what kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, the individuals who are managing the audit program need to think about things that could potentially impact their ability to achieve the program's objectives.
So things that could go wrong or things that could create opportunities for improvement.
Exactly. And they need to consider the context of the auditee as well, because that can influence the risks and opportunities associated with the program.
Okay, so what are some examples of potential risks?
Well, during the planning phase, you could run into risks if you set objectives that aren't relevant to the auditee's needs, or if you have a poorly defined scope for the program, or if you haven't planned enough audits or scheduled them appropriately.
So you could end up with an audit program that's not really addressing the right things.
Exactly. And then there are resource-related risks, like not allocating enough time or money to the program, or not having the right equipment or training available for the auditors.
So you could end up with a program that's under-resourced and can't be executed effectively.
Exactly. And then there are risks associated with selecting the audit team, like not having enough people with the right skills and expertise.
So you could end up with an audit team that's not qualified to do the job.
Precisely. And then there's the risk of ineffective communication, both within the audit team and between the audit team and the auditee.
So misunderstandings, misinterpretations, things getting lost in translation.
Exactly. And then during the implementation phase, you could have risks related to poor coordination of audit activities or a failure to adequately consider information security.
So things could get chaotic and disorganized, or sensitive information could be compromised.
Exactly. And then there are risks associated with managing documented information, like not having clear processes for identifying, protecting, and storing important records.
So you could end up losing valuable information or having it fall into the wrong hands.
Exactly. And then there's the risk of not monitoring, reviewing, and improving the audit program itself.
So you could end up with a program that becomes stagnant and outdated.
Exactly. And finally, there's the risk of not having the auditee's cooperation and support.
So they might not be willing to provide the necessary information or access, or they might try to obstruct the audit process.
All of these things could potentially derail the audit program and prevent it from achieving its objectives.
Okay, so there are a lot of potential pitfalls.
There are, but the good news is there are also opportunities for improvement.
Oh, okay, like what?
Well, one opportunity is to conduct multiple audits during a single site visit, which can save time and money on travel expenses.
That makes sense, especially if you're dealing with an auditee that has multiple locations.
Exactly. Another opportunity is to carefully match the competence of the audit team members to the specific requirements of each audit.
So you're making sure you have the right people with the right skills for each job.
Exactly. And another opportunity is to align the audit dates with the availability of key personnel at the auditee.
So you're minimizing disruptions to their operations and making sure you have access to the people you need to talk to.
Exactly. It's all about being strategic and finding ways to make the audit program more efficient and effective.
Okay, so you're not just reacting to problems, you're proactively looking for ways to improve things.
Exactly. And that's what good audit program management is all about.
Okay, so now let's move on to Clause 5.4, which is all about establishing the audit program.
All right, so this is where we actually start building the program itself.
Right, taking all those considerations we've been talking about and putting them into practice.
Exactly. And Clause 5.4 starts by outlining the roles and responsibilities of the individuals who are going to be managing the program.
Okay, so who are these people and what are they in charge of?
Well, these are the folks who are essentially the stewards of the audit program. They have a lot of responsibility for making sure it's set up and run effectively.
So they're like the project managers for the whole thing.
Yeah. Pretty much, yeah. And their responsibilities cover a wide range of areas. They're responsible for defining the overall extent of the program based on the objectives that have been set and any constraints they need to work within.
Okay, so how big is the program going to be? How many audits are we talking about? What's the time frame? All of that.
Exactly. And they're also responsible for identifying and addressing any internal or external issues that could impact the program, as well as any risks and opportunities that have been identified.
So they're constantly scanning the horizon for anything that could affect the program's success.
Exactly. And they're also responsible for making sure that competent audit teams are put together.
Meaning the teams have the right skills and expertise to do the job.
Exactly. They need to assign specific roles, responsibilities, and authority to each team member, and they need to provide support to the team leaders.
So they're kind of like the coaches for the audit teams.
In a way, yeah. And then they're responsible for establishing all the necessary processes for the program, like coordinating and scheduling the audits, defining the objective, scope, and criteria for each individual audit, determining the appropriate audit methods, selecting the audit team members, and all of that.
Wow, that sounds like a lot.
It is, and that's not even all of it.
Yeah.
They're also responsible for evaluating the performance of the auditors, establishing effective communication channels, managing any disputes or complaints, overseeing follow-up activities, preparing reports, and communicating with all the relevant stakeholders.
It sounds like a really demanding role.
It is, but it's a crucial one because the success of the whole audit program hinges on the competence and diligence of the individuals who are managing it.
Right, they're the ones who set the tone and make sure everything runs smoothly.
Exactly. And on top of all that, they also need to make sure the audit teams have the resources they need to do their jobs effectively.
So things like funding equipment, training support staff, all of that.
Exactly. And they also need to make sure that all the necessary documentation is created, maintained, and properly managed.
So all the records of the program, the audits, the team members, everything.
Exactly. And they need to keep track of all the relevant information security and confidentiality requirements.
So making sure that sensitive information is protected.
Exactly. And of course, they're responsible for monitoring, reviewing, and improving the audit program itself.
Right, always looking for ways to make it better.
Exactly. And finally, they need to communicate all the details of the program to the audit client and any other relevant interested parties, and they need to get formal approval for the program from the audit client before they can go ahead and implement it.
So they're basically the point person for the entire audit program.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Okay, so what about the competence of these individuals? What kind of knowledge and skills do they need to have to be effective in this role?
Well, the standard lays out a pretty comprehensive set of requirements, given all the responsibilities they have. They need a really strong foundation in auditing principles, methodologies, and processes.
So they need to understand the theory and practice of auditing.
Exactly. And they also need a good grasp of the relevant management system standards, as well as any other pertinent standards or guidance documents.
So they need to be up to date on all the latest requirements.
Exactly. And they also need to have a deep understanding of the auditee in its specific context.
So all those internal and external issues we talked about earlier, the needs of their stakeholders, their core business activities, all of that.
Exactly. They need to know the organization inside and out.
And they need to be familiar with all the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements that apply to the auditee's operations.
Absolutely. So they can make sure the audit program is addressing all the relevant legal and compliance issues.
Okay, so it's a pretty diverse skill set.
It is. And depending on the specific nature of the audit program, there might be other areas of expertise that would be beneficial, like risk management principles, project and process management methodologies, or even knowledge of ICT.
So it really depends on the context of the audit program.
Exactly. And just like the auditors themselves, the individuals managing the program need to engage in continual professional development to keep their skills and knowledge up to date.
Right, because things are always changing.
Absolutely. Now, moving on to subclause 5.4.3, which deals with establishing the extent of the audit program.
Okay, so we've talked about this a little bit already, but can you go into more detail about the factors that determine how extensive an audit program needs to be?
Sure, the standard emphasizes that the extent of the program is heavily influenced by the information provided by the auditee about their specific context.
So how big and complex is the organization? What kind of risks and opportunities are they facing? What are their objectives? All of that.
Exactly. And as we mentioned earlier, in some cases, the program might even just consist of a single audit if the situation is very straightforward.
Right. So it can be scaled down if necessary.
Exactly. But in most cases, there will be multiple factors that need to be considered when determining the extent of the program.
Okay, like what?
Well, first you need to think about the objectives of the program, and each individual audit the scope of the program, and each audit the duration of each audit, the total number of audits, the methods you'll use for reporting findings, and whether there will be any follow-up activities.
So all those logistical details.
Exactly. And then you need to consider the specific criteria that will be used as the basis for the audits, whether those are management system standards, industry best practices, legal requirements, or something else.
Right, the benchmarks you'll be using to evaluate the auditee.
Exactly. And then there are factors related to the auditee's operations, like the number, significance, complexity, similarity, and geographical location of the activities that will be audited.
So how much ground are you covering?
Exactly. And then you need to think about anything that could potentially affect the effectiveness of the auditee's management system.
So any weaknesses, vulnerabilities, or areas for improvement?
Exactly. And then you need to look at the results of any previous audits or management reviews that have been conducted.
So you're learning from past experience.
Exactly. And you also need to consider language, cultural, and social factors that could impact the audits.
So if you're dealing with an organization that operates in multiple countries or has a diverse workforce, you need to make sure the audit team is equipped to handle those differences.
Exactly. And then you need to consider the concerns and expectations of interested parties.
So have there been any complaints or issues raised by customers, employees, or other stakeholders?
Exactly. And you also need to think about any significant changes that have occurred in the auditee's context or operations, as well as any related risks and opportunities.
So is the organization going through a merger or acquisition? Are they implementing a new technology? Are they expanding into a new market? All of that.
Exactly. And then there's the availability and use of information and communication technology for supporting audit activities, particularly remote audits.
So can you use technology to conduct some or all of the audits remotely, or do you need to be on site?
Exactly. And then you need to think about any internal or external events that could impact the audits, like nonconformities, incidents, or changes in the regulatory landscape.
So anything that could disrupt the audit process or change the scope of the audit.
Exactly. And finally, you need to consider the overall business risks and opportunities faced by the auditee.
So what are the biggest challenges and opportunities facing the organization, and how could those impact the audit program?
Exactly. It's a lot to take in, but the bottom line is that the extent of the audit program needs to be carefully considered and tailored to the specific circumstances of the auditee.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Absolutely. Now moving on to subclause 5.4.4, which deals with determining the resources that will be needed for the audit program.
Okay, so now that we know how big the program is going to be, we need to figure out what kind of resources we'll need to make it happen.
Exactly. And this includes a whole range of things. First and foremost, you need to think about financial resources.
So how much money is going to be needed to fund the program?
Exactly. You need to cover things like auditor fees, travel expenses, training costs, equipment costs, and any other associated expenses.
So it can be a significant investment depending on the size and complexity of the program.
It can be. And then you need to think about time resources.
So how much time is going to be needed to plan, execute, and report on the audits?
Exactly. You need to factor in things like travel time, audit time report, writing time, follow-up time, and so on.
And you need to make sure that the auditors have enough time to do their jobs properly.
Absolutely. You don't want to rush them or cut corners.
And then, of course, you need to think about the competence of the auditors themselves.
Absolutely. You need to make sure you have enough auditors with the right skills and expertise to cover all the areas that will be audited.
And you might need to bring in technical experts if there are specialized areas that require specific knowledge.
Exactly. And then you need to consider the overall extent and complexity of the program, as well as any identified risks and opportunities that could impact resource needs.
So if the program is very large or complex, or if there are significant risks involved, you'll need to allocate more resources accordingly.
Exactly. And then there are logistical considerations like travel time and associated costs, accommodation arrangements, and the impact of different time zones if the auditee has operations in multiple locations.
So you need to think about all the practical details of getting the auditors where they need to be.
Exactly. And then there's the availability and effective utilization of information and communication technology for conducting remote audits.
So do you have the necessary hardware, software, and technical support to conduct audits remotely?
Exactly. And then you need to think about any specialized tools, technologies, or equipment that might be needed.
Like specialized software for analyzing data or equipment for testing physical products?
Exactly. And then you need to make sure that the auditors have access to all the necessary documented information.
So policies, procedures, records, data, all of that.
Exactly. And finally, you need to consider any facility-related requirements, like security clearances or personal protective equipment.
So anything that's needed to ensure the safety and security of the auditors.
Exactly. It's a lot to think about. But it's all crucial for making sure the audit program is properly resourced and can be executed effectively.
Right. You don't want to skimp on resources and then end up with an audit program that can't achieve its objectives.
Exactly. Now, moving on to Clause 5.5, which is all about implementing the audit program.
Okay, so we've established the program, we've determined the resources, now it's time to put it all into action.
Exactly. Subclause 5.5.1 provides some general guidance for this implementation phase.
Okay, so what are the key things to keep in mind during implementation?
Well, once the program has been established and the resources have been allocated, the focus shifts to operational planning and coordination.
So making sure all the pieces are in place and everything is running smoothly.
Exactly. And the individuals managing the program have a lot of responsibility during this phase.
Okay, like what?
Well, first, they need to make sure that all the relevant stakeholders are aware of the program and its details.
So the audit client, the auditee, any other interested parties?
Exactly. They need to communicate the objectives, the scope, the schedule, the resources, all of that.
And they need to keep everyone informed about the program's progress.
Absolutely. Regular communication is essential.
Okay, and then they need to define the specific objectives, scope, and criteria for each individual audit within the program.
Exactly. And they need to make sure those align with the overall objectives and scope of the program.
Right, so each audit is contributing to the bigger picture.
Exactly. And they need to select the appropriate audit methods for each audit.
So on-site, remote, or a combination of both?
Exactly. And they need to coordinate and schedule all the audits and any other related activities.
So making sure everything runs smoothly and on time.
Exactly. And they need to make sure the audit teams have the necessary competence and resources.
Right, the right people with the right skills and tools.
Exactly. And they need to oversee the conduct of the audits to make sure they're carried out in accordance with the program and to manage any risks, opportunities, or issues that arise.
So they're keeping a close eye on things.
Exactly. And they need to manage and maintain all the relevant documentation.
Right, all the audit plans, reports, records, evidence, all of that.
Exactly. And they need to define and implement operational controls for monitoring the program.
So they can track progress, identify issues, and make adjustments as needed.
Exactly. And finally, they need to continuously review the program to identify opportunities for improvement.
So always looking for ways to make things better.
Exactly. It's a very hands-on role during implementation.
It sounds like it. Okay, so now let's talk about subclause 5.5.2, which deals with defining the objective scope and criteria for individual audits.
All right, so this is where we start getting into the specifics of each audit within the program.
Right, so we've set the overall objectives for the program. Now we need to break those down into smaller chunks for each individual audit.
Exactly. And the standard is very clear that each individual audit needs to have its own clearly defined set of objectives, scope, and criteria.
Okay, so what's the difference between the objectives of the program and the objectives of an individual audit?
Well, think of the program objectives as the big picture goals. the things you're ultimately trying to achieve with the entire audit program.
Okay, so like improving the effectiveness of the management system or ensuring compliance with regulations.
Exactly. And then think of the objectives of an individual audit as the smaller, more specific goals that will help you achieve those bigger picture goals.
So like evaluating the effectiveness of a specific process or verifying compliance with a particular requirement.
Exactly. Each audit is like a piece of the puzzle that contributes to the overall picture.
That's a good analogy. And the scope of an individual audit, what does that cover?
The scope defines the boundaries of the audit. It tells
Mhm.
you what's being audited and what's not.
Okay, so it could be limited to a specific department or process, or it could cover the entire organization.
Exactly. And it also specifies the time frame for the audit.
So what period of time are you looking at?
Exactly. And then there are the audit criteria, which are the benchmarks you'll be using to evaluate the auditee's performance.
So the standards, guidelines, or requirements that you're measuring against.
Exactly. And these criteria can come from a variety of sources.
Like what?
Well, they could come from the auditee's own policies, procedures, or performance targets.
So their internal documentation?
Exactly. Or they could come from relevant statutory or regulatory requirements.
So the laws and regulations that apply to their operations.
Exactly. Or they could come from the requirements of the applicable management system standards.
So ISO 9001, ISO 14001, ISO 45001, all of those.
Exactly. Or they could come from other sources like industry codes of conduct, best practices, or even contractual agreements.
So it's a pretty broad range of possibilities.
It is, but the key is to make sure that the criteria are relevant to the objectives of the audit and that they're clear and unambiguous.
Right. You need to be able to measure performance against a specific standard.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that if you need to make changes to the objectives, scope, or criteria of an individual audit, they could potentially impact the overall audit program.
So you might need to go back and revise the program itself.
Exactly. And if you do make changes, you need to make sure everyone is aware of them and that you have the necessary approvals from the audit client.
Right. You don't want to make unilateral changes without consulting the relevant stakeholder.
Exactly. And in the case of combined audits where you're auditing multiple management systems at the same time, it's especially important to make sure that the objectives, scope, and criteria are consistent across all the relevant audit programs.
So you're not sending mixed messages or creating confusion.
Exactly. Now, moving on to subclause 5.5.3, which deals with selecting and determining the audit methods.
Okay, so now that we know what we're auditing and how we're going to measure performance, we need to figure out how we're actually going to conduct the audit.
Exactly. And the standard recognizes that there are different ways to conduct audits and that the best approach will depend on the specific circumstances.
Okay, so what are some of the options?
Well, the most common approaches are on-site audits and remote audits.
So on-site means you're physically going to the auditee's location.
Exactly. And remote audits are conducted using technology like video conferencing, document sharing, and remote access tools.
So you can audit an organization without ever having to set foot in their office.
Exactly. And the standard also allows for a combination of on-site and remote auditing.
So you could do some parts of the audit remotely and then go on-site for other parts.
Exactly. And the decision of which approach to use should be based on a careful consideration of the risks and opportunities associated with each.
Okay, so what are some of the risks and opportunities of on-site audits?
Well, on-site audits allow for more direct interaction with the auditee and their staff.
So you can observe their operations firsthand, interview people face-to-face, and get a better feel for the organization's culture.
Exactly. But on-site audits can also be more time-consuming and expensive, especially if the auditee has multiple locations or if there are travel restrictions in place.
Right. And there's the added risk of disrupting the auditee's operations.
Exactly. Now, what about remote audits? What are some of the risks and opportunities there?
Well, remote audits can be more efficient and cost-effective because you're not incurring travel expenses.
Exactly. And they can be less disruptive to the auditee's operations.
But you might not get the same level of interaction and insight as you would with an on-site audit.
That's true. And there are also risks associated with data security and